The hall was empty. Silence swallowed the grandeur that once roared with life. Aiden Vale stood alone, his crown heavy on his head, his eyes tracing the faded banners that told stories of victories long gone. Once, the world had bowed to him. Now, only shadows remained. He reached for the throne, but it felt colder than stone. Success, the very thing he had chased, the thing he had conquered, had turned into his prison. In that stillness, a question haunted him. How did a king fall, not by enemies, but by himself? Aiden Vale was not born to a throne. He grew up in the narrow streets of a small village, where the sun burned brighter than the gilded crowns he would one day see. His father, a blacksmith, taught him that strength meant more than muscle. It meant courage, honesty, and loyalty. Every scar on his hands told a story of work, of perseverance, of a life earned, not given. Even as a boy, Aiden dreamed bigger than the village walls could contain. He ran across fields at dawn, practicing with a wooden sword taller than himself, imagining battles where he protected the weak and inspired the fearful. Children laughed and called him reckless, but those who watched closely saw the spark of a leader in his piercing blue eyes. At 16, he joined the king's army, not for glory, but because he wanted to fight for those who could not defend themselves. Each challenge shaped him: the harsh winters, the relentless drills, the endless nights on watch. Yet, it was never the discipline or the victories that defined him. It was his heart. Aiden's courage was quiet but unwavering, his compassion visible even amidst the chaos of war. His reputation grew. Soldiers admired him. Villagers whispered his name with hope. And slowly, the world began to notice a young man who moved not for power, but for purpose. For Aiden, greatness was not about being remembered in golden halls. It was about standing tall when others fell and holding the line when everyone else turned away. By the time he was 20, the boy who had once chased the dawn across empty fields had become a force the kingdom could not ignore. The path ahead was uncertain, but one truth remained unshaken. Aiden Vale was destined for something extraordinary. Aiden Vale's victories became legend. With every battle he won, his name spread across kingdoms. Soldiers spoke of his bravery. Villagers told tales of his fairness. The people did not just follow him, they believed in him. By 25, Aiden was no longer a soldier. He was a leader, a beacon of hope, and the rightful heir to the throne, chosen by both destiny and the people's hearts. When the old king passed, there was no doubt. Aiden ascended to the throne, and the kingdom celebrated. He vowed to rule with the same courage and compassion that had carried him from the village streets to the battlefield. For years he honored that promise. Justice thrived, the poor were protected, and the once ignored voices of the people were finally heard. But as the palace walls grew taller and the halls grander, so did the whispers of legacy and glory. Advisors, once loyal, began planting seeds of pride. They spoke of immortality, conquest, and the need to leave a mark that would outlast centuries. Slowly, Aiden began to listen, not to the people, but to the temptation of legend. He rode through his lands with pride swelling in his chest, banners waving in the wind, armies at his back. Citizens cheered, but their faces blurred into the crowd. Success, once a tool to protect and inspire, started to feel like a chain, binding him to appearances and expectations. The king who once fought for others now felt the intoxicating weight of being revered above all. Even the boy who had once run across open fields chasing dawns began to feel the pull of something else: power. The world adored him, feared him, and for the first time, he wondered if his heart could sustain it all. The crown felt heavier with every passing day, not because of responsibility, but because of the very thing he had dreamed of: being remembered, immortal, untouchable. The stage was set. The people's king was now the king of his own ambition. And ambition, Aiden would soon learn, is a flame that can warm or burn everything in its path. Aiden Vale had everything a man could desire: armies at his command, lands stretching beyond sight, and the unwavering admiration of his people. Yet, with every crown he wore, and every cheer he heard, something inside him shifted. The boy who once ran across open fields to protect the weak now walked palace halls, measuring worth by gold, glory, and fear. Whispers in his ear grew louder. Advisors praised his brilliance, yet subtly questioned his mercy. Friends who once challenged him were now silenced, either out of fear or envy. Slowly, Aiden learned a dangerous truth. The world bows to power, not to kindness. He began to test his influence, to see how far the loyalty of others would stretch. And each test brought a thrill he had never known. His eyes, once filled with empathy, now scanned faces for weakness. Every smile became a mask, every compliment a trap. Success, which had once lifted him and those around him, now felt like a chain, binding him to expectations he no longer remembered he had. The victories that once inspired pride now sparked arrogance. The cheers of the people no longer warmed him. They echoed emptily, reminders of the pedestal he had climbed alone. Aiden stopped visiting the villages he once protected. He stopped listening to the quiet warnings of those who still cared. The palace grew grander, but the warmth that once filled it vanished. And in that silence, the first cracks appeared, not in the walls, but in the man himself. He did not notice the danger creeping around him, the way envy, fear, and resentment quietly spread among those who had once followed him faithfully. He believed that success was untouchable, that he was untouchable. And that belief, more than any sword or enemy, was the true poison that would one day bring him to his knees. The halls of the palace were no longer filled with life. Servants whispered in corners, soldiers avoided his gaze, and even the courtiers who had once bowed in admiration now exchanged wary glances. Aiden Vale, the man who had once inspired loyalty and love, now walked alone among ghosts of his own making. The kingdom he had built with blood, sweat, and heart began to crumble, not from external enemies, but from neglect. Villages fell into disrepair. Trade faltered. Citizens who had once cheered his name now muttered complaints in hushed tones. The people's king had become distant, unrelatable, and untouchable. Aiden tried to hold on. He summoned his advisors, commanded his armies, and issued decrees meant to restore order. Yet no battle strategy, no royal command, could repair the trust that had been broken. His crown felt heavier than ever, not with glory, but with the weight of failure. One night, standing alone in the grand hall, he saw himself in the polished floor. He didn't see the triumphant king who had risen from humble beginnings. He saw a man hardened by pride, isolated by arrogance, and blinded by ambition. The victories he had once cherished now mocked him. The cheers that had lifted his heart were replaced by silence. He realized then a bitter truth. He had not lost his kingdom to war, betrayal, or fate. He had lost it to himself. Every choice made for power rather than purpose, every compromise of his own values, had paved the way for this solitude. Success, which had once been his greatest ally, had become his most formidable enemy. The realization came with no applause, no fanfare, only the quiet, suffocating understanding that sometimes the mightiest kings fall, not because of the world outside, but because of the world they build inside themselves. And Aiden Vale, once the people's king, now understood the cost of losing himself to the very thing he had sought to master. Years passed, and the once great halls that had echoed with pomp and pride were silent. Aiden Vale walked not as a king, but as a man who had seen the heights of glory and the depths of solitude. He no longer sought applause or admiration. He no longer wore a crown. What he carried now was a quiet understanding that true greatness is measured not by power, but by the hearts you touch. He walked among the people, not as their ruler, but as a guide. Villagers who once feared his distant majesty now looked upon him with respect, not for his rank, but for the humility in his eyes. He listened to their stories, shared their burdens, and reminded them that courage and kindness mattered more than titles or wealth. Aiden often thought of the crown he had once worn, heavy with pride and expectation. Now without it, he felt lighter, freer. He had been king of an empire, but he had learned that being king of oneself is far greater. His failures had taught him what victories never could, that power without purpose is a hollow prize. He shared his lessons with those who sought guidance, teaching that ambition should never blind compassion, and that success is only meaningful when it uplifts others rather than isolates oneself. And in doing so, he became more than a legend of battle or rule. He became a beacon of wisdom, a man whose story warned of pride and celebrated humility. Aidan Vale had lost a kingdom, but he had gained something far more enduring. The knowledge that the heart, when guided by purpose and compassion, is the truest throne a man can ever claim. And in the eyes of those he touched, he found a new kind of crown, one that no power could take and no pride could tarnish.